Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: The Rope. In 1910, in the tranquil seaside town of Asbury Park, New Jersey, 10-year-old schoolgirl Marie Smith was brutally murdered. Small-town officials, unable to find the culprit, call upon the young manager of a New York detective agency for help. It is the detective's first murder case. And now, the specifics of the investigation and the daring sting operation that caught the killer is captured in all its rich detail for the first time by author Alex Tresniowski in his thrilling true crime book, The Rope. Mr. Tresniowski joins me now. Welcome, Alex.
James, how are you? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Very good. So, the issue, first of all, this goes way back in time. I mean, it's in 1910-ish, turn of the century, if you will, Asbury Park, New Jersey. And before we jump in, why don't you give my audience a little bit bio of what your life, maybe not since birth, but how you come to me today. How did you? And I know one of the books
I was born in a log cabin, and then my mother. No, what I am is a writer from a very early age, and at one point I was a senior writer at People magazine, writing true crime, and no matter how many celebrity stories they ran, the true crime stories were always the most popular stories in People, which had 38 million people readership. So I kind of always was fascinated by that, as we all are, as you are. The grislier the crime, it seems, the better. So, I ended up writing books, sometimes in the voice of other people, sometimes in my own voice, and stumbled across this story a few years ago I was amazed nobody else had sort of written about, and just jumped in with both feet. It's a good, juicy crime story, and I apologize if I ever talk about a story that involves the death of a minor in a flip way, but it's obviously a tragedy, but it's for a storyteller, it had all the elements.
And as I remember from either an author's note or something, that you sort of came across it by coming across the grave, I believe, of the victim.
I knew about somebody who had discovered this batch of documents at a flea market that turned out to be the police files of the main character, Raymond Schindler. So that had become part of the public record, but not in a literary way. It was just sort of a dump of documents. So, the first thing I saw was that the victim in this story, which is a 10-year-old girl named Marie Smith in the town of Asbury Park back in 1910, was buried in Brooklyn, which was not far from where I live, in a cemetery there. So I went to find her grave. That was the beginning, before I even knew I was going to do this book, and had a hard time finding it. Had to go find a guy. He leads me to a little spot between two other graves that's just weeds. And presumably because she was 10, she might have had a smaller tombstone, but at this point she had nothing. Not a marker, not a number, just no way. But that was the spot where she lay. And it seemed just kind of sad and overwhelming to me that, not even a place to mark her and that she mattered and lived, and that's true of a lot of people. So after that, I said, let me look into this. And I found that there was a terrific true crime story. And that was that. I was off and running. Like I said, it's, the research was fun.
Now, I tease the audience as we go along that this story is every time, and it's corny, a page turner, but every time something was going on, I thought, oh, come on, and we'll get to that. Mostly to do with the rope, and we'll explain the double meaning. But in the case of the murder, the rope concept is just. I mean, they use other terms, other in detective stories, whatever. But I like the verbiage, the rope, and you just each turn that the rope, a new rope, as you will, each one of these gimmicks, is it at times becomes hysterical. As you say, if it wasn't so serious, this could make a great comedy.
Yeah.
And so again, what we're talking now, the parallel part of it, the crime, is a woman named Ida Wells, and she is connected to it. She starts her own life in the book, and then her story intersects certainly near the end with the murder, with the crime. But her story, and she's probably got her own bios out there, which people should look those up too, is that she was involved. Again, we don't think of this in the 1900s, but lynching, and even in the North, terrible crimes against people who have not been convicted of a crime, lynching, and the whole. You should also people should look up lynching is from a particular. Judge that was doing this years ago, and it could also, everyone thinks of hanging, but a lot of times it was beating to death, drawn and
Mhm.
quartering people, shooting them en masse, removing
Mhm.
people from a jail and the mob just killing them. And she rose up, during this period and as a writer and eventually becomes very involved with the beginning of the NAACP.
Yeah.
And in the end, the NAACP has a hand in, we'll get to that, in the settlement of the crime, bringing the real person, not necessarily the real person, but clearing a person who spent, and we'll get to that too, spent weeks, months, whatever, in jail uncharged, I believe, with this crime, but
Mhm.
was kept in jail. And
Yeah.
of course, his life was in danger at that point because he was to be the killer. So that's sort of the background of the two stories of Ida Wells and this crime. So let's go back to the crime. Let's go back to the date. Again, it's a young lady, Marie Smith, and that she goes missing.
Yeah, you did a great summary. It really is two parallel stories that meet. The two main characters are Raymond Schindler, who is a very fresh-faced detective in New York City. Raymond Schindler, who's a really kind of rookie, raw detective in New York City, who finds himself on his first murder case, which was the murder of this little girl in Asbury Park called Marie Smith. Um, they have a suspect immediately, whose name is Tom Williams, called Black Diamond because he used to be a boxer who fought under that name. And as happened a lot in the North and the South in 1910, there was a rush to judgment, and very, very nearly, Tom Williams was dragged out of his cell and lynched. That happened a lot of times, more than have ever been recorded. But it ended up becoming the third case ever handled by the NAACP, this brand new advocacy group for Black Americans, that Ida Wells had a hand in. Now, Ida Wells lived 70 years before, the events of this. She was still alive in 1910, but most of the work she did was in the latter part of the 19th century, where she was this incredible journalist who was the first one to write about the lynching phenomena in detail. She had an amazing document called The Red Record, which literally listed this person hung for this crime, no evidence, this, blah, 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 blah. And it was just an incredible litany of extrajudicial lynchings where there were no trials, there was no nothing. Sometimes the charges were minuscule, speaking while a white person was speaking. So she was an incredible advocate for that. And her whole career built up to certain events that are in the book that had an impact on the Tom Williams case, and including instituting a law where sheriffs in a town where a black person was taken out of a jail cell and lynched, those sheriffs would lose their jobs. And that turned out to be huge because it was an institutional thing that happened with lynching. There were never any suspects. Nobody ever said they saw anything, even though there's 1,000 people in town watching it. It was just built in that way. And the sheriffs, ultimately were responsible for guarding these prisoners in little jail cells, didn't do their job. So she fought in a lot of different ways for the rights of Black Americans who at that time were so disenfranchised and didn't really have dominion over their own bodies. They could literally be plucked off the street and lynched. So that was the fate that awaited this poor guy named Tom Williams in Asbury Park, who immediately drew suspicion as the person who killed Marie Smith. This is a little girl, 10-year-old girl in Asbury Park, which is an interesting place too. All white, built for white people, surrounded by these sort of suburbs of black people because they hired black people to work at this resort. So immediately, she was found in the woods after being missing for 5 days, uh, brutally harmed and abused. And they went out and rounded up Tom Williams, and they were just ready to throw the book at him or worse. So fortunately, there was one guy in town, the father of Marie Smith. He worked for a guy named, I'm sorry, Randolph Miller, who ran a rendering plant in town. They made soap from all these different things. He financed another detective to come in, and that detective was Raymond Schindler. He wanted to get at the truth. He saw what was happening. And what's really interesting is what Raymond Schindler does next. He's a very unconventional detective, never fired a gun, never even carried a gun, yet put away a lot of people. And in this incredible a new psychological approach to getting confessions out of suspects. So,
But again, this guy, like you said, I believe he was, again, we don't have to go into a lot of detail, but he was on the West Coast, I believe, and he was sort of connected to the Burns agency and somehow finds his way through them. We don't, again, so complicated. We're not going to get into that, but he ends up in
mhm.
New York City slash, because a lot of this happens both because of proximity, happens in Asbury Park, but also the man who actually did the murder ends up, sort of like not running away, but going to New York City. So a lot of the investigation and or the trickery ends up being taken part in New York City.
Yeah,
So what? So he again, there's some discussion, I guess, if someone saw something, people who think they may have seen the little girl talking to someone, this and that. So that allows um, uh, Ray, and I believe the sheriff, who is a little bit Herrick, a little bit
yeah,
in the beginning, not happy about this. I mean, he's the one locally in charge, and
right.
so, and again, during part of this, he says we can't do this anymore; it's too expensive, and
Right.
so they're sort of at loggerheads about keep going. But Ray comes in and he's got a plan. Tell
Yes,
us
he does.
what tell us what Ray's plan is.
Uh, Fascinating guy. Grew up in the West, actually grew up in upstate New York, believe it or not too far from you. His father was a preacher, and from his father, he got this incredible sense of right and wrong and damnation and, a line between good and evil. And his mother was a librarian in prisons. She would start libraries in prisons. And I think from her, Raymond Schindler got this incredible compassion for the worst elements of society. So that combined would play a part in this future crime. But he started out as a boy, went to San Francisco a day before the giant earthquake of 1908, and was so looking for work, he took a job just selling water near the burning houses. As the city is burning, he's in there, finds a flyer on the floor that says, "We're looking for detectives. We need you to go around and talk to people and find out what happened, about from this earthquake." Turned out the flyer was from an insurance company. They were just hiring people to try to get out of claims. But Schindler loved doing it so much, loved interrogating people, loved finding out information from them that, he immediately became a detective in New York City. So his thing was he just was very fascinated with the psychology of a criminal. And, back then, everything is psychology. Now everything is profiling, Silence of the Lambs. But back then it would really was joked about. I mean, it was not a credible thing to say, we've got to profile this killer. But he believed in that. He was influenced by Hugo Musterberg, who was a German psychologist who was pioneering in the field of understanding the physical tells that people have that even though they're lying, their body's not lying, and that actually set the stage for lie detectors and other ways to gauge guilt and lying. So he just believed that the ultimate measure of justice was getting a confession. It also served the purpose of sort of purging the soul of the criminal, you know. So that's where his sort of preacher background came in. Wasn't just interested in putting them away. He wanted them to confess to their sins to see what they did wrong. So he bought this bag of tricks to Asbury Park to try to find out who the real killer was. Now, everybody thought it was Tom Williams. As you said, the sheriff in town, the commissioner, they were all ready to just wrap the case up. Everybody wanted a verdict. They wanted this to be behind them because this stuff didn't happen that often. Um, but he just went there and he just set about really doing kind of incredible things to flush out a guilty party. And it is fun, actually, some of the stuff. I mean, I can give you one example where in the house where he believed a suspect lived, well, he knew the suspect lived there, but it was somebody who suspected the crime. He hired a man, a detective, to throw a rock at the doghouse outside this house every hour on the hour at night. The idea was, and it was influenced by the Hounds of the Baskerville, the Holmes story, was to rattle this suspect and see how he acted. And they actually had surveillance where they saw him pacing in his room and sort of, the idea was let's flesh the guilt out of him. And so they had this dog barking every hour on the hour for 6 days by throwing rocks at this doghouse. It didn't produce confession, but it did sort of move things along in terms of who they thought did it. And, and their other ruses would follow. At this point, I just want to say what the rope is. Eventually he gets into a situation, and Raymond Schindler had seen this done, where the idea is to get close to the suspect without letting them know that it's you. So you have an agent working undercover, and they call him the rope. His object is to pull the guy in, befriend him in a cafeteria, get him to feel comfortable enough to confess his sins to you. And so that's why it's called the rope on one level. But that's what Schindler did. They followed the suspect out of Asbury Park to Lower Manhattan, which is a whole nother part of the story, and try to just rope him in fascinating ways. I'm not sure all of them would be legal today. They might be seen as
I
entrapment,
would
but
think I would think most of them would not. I mean, I don't think they'd make Supreme Court muster. My favorite, we'll get to that. Just throwing it in because I'll forget, is where this is sometime he's being questioned, and no, it was it Williams? I'm confused, but they have someone who pretends to be a lawyer. The guy asks for a lawyer. Was that Williams
no, yeah, it
or
was Williams,
it
and
was?
they sent a detective in pretending to be a lawyer. Now that's nuts,
No,
but
you don't do that now.
listen, compared to the other fates that might have befallen Tom Williams, and they did that to Tom Williams with the not to try to prove him guilty, but to try to establish his innocence. They didn't do it when they actually had the another suspect in jail. But yeah, sure, it was crazy. Any number of the things they did probably, like you said, wouldn't pass muster today in court. Elaborate setups, renting out a movie theater and showing a movie for a specific purpose. Any number of things, and then what happened back then ended up creating modern crime fighting. The psychology aspect of it was literally laughed out of the business, in the World's Fair a few years before. And suddenly now it's become just an accepted part of crime fighting. I don't think anybody is like Schindler, who is so devoted to getting confessions out of people as a way to cleanse them. In fact, he ended up getting 11 confessions out of his suspect. I don't want to say his name in case you're going to read the book and have some suspense, but not one, not two, but 11 times he got him to go through his whole story. So that was a lot of soul cleansing. And, I don't think there's anybody who would do all that today. But it was a confluence of this young detective who had this fascination with a certain way of going about his job and just the right crime. And it became, to me, a great untold crime story.
Now, his partner in crime solving who took on these many. Well, this one particular role, again, starting in the cafeteria. Again, this was something in New York City, and that you have big place where you can it's a restaurant. It's not like a food kitchen, but you go in
Right.
and same thing like in high school, you have your tray and you get the food you want. What his partner in crime fighting was Carl Neumeister.
Mhm.
And what a hoot this guy is. Tell us a little bit
Uh,
about Carl. And I
you know,
forget, how did Carl and Ray hook up? I
well,
forget.
Carl was another detective. There's not a lot about him in the historical record, which is a shame because to me he was one of the most interesting guys. But he had a German background. Obviously, spoke German. The suspect was German. The suspect fled to the 14th Street area, Union Square area of Manhattan, which at that time just had a monstrous influx of German immigrants. Perfect place for him to blend in. So they get a guy who's German and they literally stake out the suspect, see where he goes, find him drawn to one particular cafeteria, and they plop their man in. They plop Carl in there with a German newspaper. First three times he comes in, doesn't say a word to him. Waits for him to say something about him reading a newspaper because they're finally sitting at the same table. And that just starts this incredible work by Carl to bring this suspect, who indeed is guilt racked and is desperate, and uh, probably can't wait to confess his sin. Um, Carl arranges that over several weeks. Careful not to spring the trap because it could just ruin it if it doesn't happen precisely. And when they spring the trap, it happens in Atlantic City, another incredible, colorful place at that time. And it involves surveillance from two adjoining hotel rooms.
Oh, well,
Um,
don't jump to that. We'll take that in its
oh,
time.
okay.
But no. But what I want to again, some of the things. Look, I want to cover a couple of the ropes or the steps in this. What happens is that they do. He needs to bond. Carl needs
Yeah.
him to bond and poke at his weaknesses. And one of the way he does that, and he doesn't what's his name? Frank
Carl.
doesn't believe it. I forgot his first name. Frank doesn't believe him at first, so he decides. And again, this is in consultation, obviously, with Ray. They decide that he is going to convince Frank that he has committed a crime. So they have a
Right.
shared guilt. And so he did this terrible thing, and so and he wants more proof of it back and forth, and then Frank is feeling a little bit more comfortable with him, so he's telling him without coming out and saying I killed this little girl. He pulls back, and then so
Right.
they're doing a dance, a tango,
Incredible
and of
dance. Yeah.
course I keep forgetting his name.
Carl.
uh Carl's stuff is all fake,
Yes.
so he can pile it on as much as he needs to convince. And then, of course, Frank becomes more dependent. He's like a little boy. He becomes more dependent, as more scared he gets about his own situation. And here's someone who won't rat me out or whatever because
Right.
he's got a secret. So they do that for a while. And then at one point, Carl wants to even show him how badass he is, and talk about the carriage ride and that whole setup. That, I'm sorry, that's the pièce de
When it
résistance.
gets made into a movie, that's a great scene. But you're absolutely right. Carl Neumeister was an upstanding detective, but had to pretend that he was a vicious, ruthless killer. And invented stories, never overdid it, was withholding of his crime too, but slowly over time, he told enough where Frank was beginning to trust him, the suspect. Uh, and one of the big efforts to establish that trust, to make, Raymond at one point determined, listen, Carl, you're doing a good job being a thug, but I don't think he's buying it all the way. We got to make you look like a real dangerous killer. And they staged a confrontation during a carriage ride, which Neumeister and the suspect took out by a sort of deserted railroad area where somebody asked Neumeister for a match, an itinerant guy. Uh, and again, not to give too much of the story away, but it was a stage shooting where Carl got to act like a tough guy and kill someone. Of course, he wasn't killed, but he did fall down in the snow, dead, as it were. And at that point, that was enough to really convince Frank, the suspect, that Carl was indeed a tough guy. And then from there, the rope tightening the rope was just a little easier. And as you said, they ended up entering to the sort of criminal partnership where Carl said, I'll take you on my next job. I'll take you all the way to Venezuela. You got to trust me. I told you what I did. Now you tell me what you did. And, it's been on, as you said, the tip of this suspect's tongue, all the time. He just can never get it out, can never quite get it out. They bring in more associates who are played by detectives. You got to tell him because he's not going to trust you. It's an incredible dance that takes a long time. I can't see anyone doing that today, the expense of it, but they literally roped him for weeks and weeks. And, that's, you can actually see as you read the book, the rope tightening and this guy, the suspect, becoming more desperate. And part of the sad thing is that he's just desperate for a friend. He's desperate for somebody to confess to and cleanse him. I mean, Raymond Schindler is right. That's what this criminal was looking for. Not all criminals are probably, but this guy was, and he had no idea he was being set up. So it's a fascinating game of cat and mouse. You hear about it all the time in police work. This was kind of an early version of it, and Schindler pioneered a lot of this stuff. So to me, it was just, a great look into the psychology of crime, and that's to me more interesting than a lot of other stuff is, why people do what they do. And if you can figure that out, can you catch them? So, that's what drew me to this story. It's just a good detective story.
Now, again, I got a juxtaposition, and we'll talk a little. I want to talk a little bit about Ida and her involvement. When she does become involved, and the NAACP gets
Yeah,
involved with Williams. That's before they may be suspect, but the crime is still open. In other words, it's not. I mean, not in this day and age, but back then, even if they had convicted Heidemann, they might still not be ready to let Williams go. And we know they hold him for a stupid thing at the end, but.
right.
So when she comes forward and gets attorneys to at least habeas corpus, get him out of jail because he's not charged, the Heidemann hasn't been charged yet, correct?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, Tom Williams, Black Diamond, the immediate suspect, doesn't really have a charge against him either, but he's been held in prison or in a jail cell for a long, long time. And through the efforts of Ida Wells, who was instrumental in the founding of the NAACP, it was founded in 1908 or 1909. This crime happened in 1910. So we're talking about months earlier, this group was founded. Interestingly enough, the NAACP was founded by all white people. Ida was one of the few black people who were sort of there pushing it, attending the meetings, doing all that. And she was a bit ostracized. People found her a little rough and coarse because, she grew up in the South and was very forward. And, that cost her. They left her off. They didn't give her credit. But thanks to her, this organization was founded. And at the time that Tom Williams was on the verge of being lynched, the NAACP had something like $12 and a roll of stamps as its assets. You find that in the records. They were threadbare. They needed contributions and stuff, but still they managed to pull up a couple of lawyers from Yale and just fresh young lawyers and send them to Asbury Park where they could appear in court for Tom Williams. And that was the first time he ever had any representation. And it's sort of a triumphant thing. It might have been the first time that such a thing happened, where this outside organization stepped in and heroically sent these lawyers down to Asbury Park to defend this man who was innocent. That's not going to give anything away, but that's why that part of the story interested me. Ida Wells didn't go to Asbury Park. When you read her story in this, it's a separate story. It's an incredible story about bravery and courage and everything she did in her life. Also remarkable. And her and Raymond Schindler ended up sort of meeting in history, not in person. But one contributed and pushed the rock up the hill this way. The other one did this way, and then boom, in 1910, that's the story I tell. How justice slowly emerged in this one particular murder of a child.
And again, this is the place for me to point it out. I do point out to all my podcasts, if it's a book, sometimes it's just a case that I'm dealing with, that we can't cover it. we can't cover any book, not its richness. That's why I like books. And I also like to have it in my hand. I don't like audiobooks, but as you can look back at a couple of pages you missed. And so you, ladies and gentlemen, you really do have to get the book because, especially because of the two different stories here and about someone very important. Um, Unfortunately, the little girl was not as important as Ida Wells, but the story of her tenacity. She had newsletters and newspapers that she published, and then they'd get destroyed and whatnot, and that she just kept going all the way to the end, and again intersects with certainly the concept of lynching and justice, and even then gets connected, as you say, not directly on site with Williams and gets him, not that he was at that point in any danger of being lynched, but he's in prison, or again jail, for this long period of time. So fast forward or return to where we were, where we're close to Carl's pretty sure that Frank's going to spill the beans. So what does Ray and his cronies set up?
So we're getting to the end game here, but I will say that anytime a black prisoner was in any jail, they were in danger of being lynched. A mob could build at any moment. And literally, it happened to Tom in the small little Asbury Park community where the mob broke through into the police station with stolen tools and stuff. So anytime you were in any prison and you were black-eyed there, you risked that. So it hadn't happened to him yet, but he was still in jail. There was a bit of a deadline. They couldn't keep him there forever. You never knew when somebody would decide to open the front door to the police station and let it happen. So there was pressure on Raymond Schindler to solve this case, and they got closer and closer with their suspect, Frank. They're getting close to where he is really ready to open up, and they schedule a trip to Atlantic City with Carl, who is the rope, and Frank and another associate, where they're going to talk about this job they're going to pull off and then all escape scot-free to Venezuela or somewhere in South America. Uh, so Frank is excited for the meeting, but at that meeting, it happens in a hotel room. Raymond gets the alternate hotel room. He gets the hotel room right next to it and adjacent. So you literally have four detectives lying on the ground in their hotel room, uh, listening through the crack in the bottom of the door at the confessions being made or not made in this other room. And, there's a stenographer there who's sort of transcribing everything. This is before any kind of devices where this could have been captured. Uh, but he had an official whose word would count, who could say, it was almost like a notary who would say, yes, that's what he said. So this group of men, no light in the room, not breathing, huddled on the floor, while right behind the door, this guy's getting grilled by Carl and this other associate. Tell us what you did. And eventually, he breaks down and talks about how he did it, why he did it. Who knows? He had a history of touchy relationships with women. He's a lonely guy, and but he gives enough information away where it's obvious that now we do have our criminal. And he's brought in, and pretty soon Tom Williams is released. And at the end of the book, it's really this sense of, wow, it's only one person. Just like Marie was only one little girl. But Tom Williams was a man. He lived, he mattered. He had people who loved him. And, the idea that he could be discarded and eliminated from society on the whim, is just not justice. Shouldn't be America. Sadly, this book came out during the George Floyd stuff. So it resonated. It echoes, we might not repeat history, but we certainly echo history. And there was a lot of echoes in what's going on today where, extrajudicial measures sometimes play a part in the justice system. So it was satisfying the way this one turned out. And, I felt like I had sort of given Marie Smith this, they called her the angel, a little bit of notice for where she was. In fact, I went back to the cemetery in Flatbush and put a little marker on her gravestone so that if people ever go there now, they'll see um, her little headstone there. So she did matter, she did live, and justice was served. That's the good part of this book. I did, however, speak to a sort of third generation relative of Marie Smith, who knew about the story, didn't know it to the depth that I now know it, and was just incredibly appreciative of somebody noticing this little girl. And no, that was satisfying. I mean, it is a personal story. Uh, but I'll also say, if you read this book, um, there's a lot of history in it. You know, there's the history of Asbury Park, which was a racist creation that slowly became something else. A baby parade in Asbury Park, what that was all about. It was an incredible thing where moms and their babies went through town, and you know, it all seems so strange now. It was 110 years ago, but it was what America was. You know, it was just a hard place that people were always trying to make better in different ways. And I just highlighted two people who did make it better in small ways. But um, ultimately, that's what drew me to the story.
Now, you mentioned sometimes I turn my mic out if I'm going to be drinking getting the ice moving here.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that, if this is ever option for a movie, which it has to be. I'm no offense. That's if someone needs my whatever. I mean, oh my God. Um, but you did do one of your books was part of a movie, and I might add this at the end if I need a filler. It's not part of the story, but I like to.
Mhm.
If I got you here, I'm going to
Sure.
get it. Vendetta. Tell us about Vendetta
Sure.
and the
Vendetta was
movie.
another true crime story that I get all my ideas by I was reading an article in the New Yorker magazine that mentioned Melvin Purvis in an interesting way, and I'd never heard of him, so I did research. He was an FBI agent in the 1930s who eventually brought to justice John Dillinger, baby-faced Nelson, and Floyd. You know, three of the biggest criminals at the time, and got run out of the FBI by Hoover, who did not like him getting all the credit. Incredible dynamic there. So I found Melvin Purvis's son, who was a professor at Boston University. We dug up everything, you know, thousands of pages of FBI files, letters from Hoover to Melvin Purvis that were affectionate in nature, maybe more, but it was obvious that Hoover idolized Mel as the perfect FBI agent, good looking, smart, erudite. But when it got away from him, when Melvin started getting all the credit, he was gone from the bureau and ultimately lived kind of an unhappy life. So that did get optioned, and it was made into a movie uh, with Johnny Depp. I think played Dillinger. Christian Bale played Melvin Purvis. A bunch of other people. It was called Public Enemies. It was based in part on on my book and another book. Wasn't a very good movie, but you know, every time I write a book, I'm hoping somehow there's potential in it. And you know, certainly I think The Rope could be if it's handled well, it could be an amazing movie.
Everyone poses the question, why are people so interested in true crime? Why do people love true crime? Why do they like 2020 and Dateline? Why? And this person opined through their data that people like the resolution, no
Hmm.
matter how gory, no matter how awful it is, they want resolution. So even if it's, a cold case that doesn't get solved, there's something about it that brings everything to a close, tied up. And certainly if there is, in this case, again, I'll, tag it at the end that he was found guilty and he was executed.
Yeah. Well, I had resolution. I have another true crime book called The Foundling, which was not resolved and is still ongoing. You know, it's another fascinating case. In case you guys really need reading material, look up The Foundling. A man whose entire identity was stolen away from him, and the things that happened and the crimes in 1960 Chicago that precipitated the story. It involves the mafia, it involves this and that. Another great story that started with a little colonel. But yeah, you know, it's fun. It's the like I said, that's really the most fun you can have as a writer is researching a story and unearthing all this stuff. And you know, it's the beauty and the. I think people go to true crime because they like to tiptoe right up to the line of raw human evil. It's such a unfathomable concept for us. It's like eternity. It's like our brains can't really figure it out. So we like to get as close as we can and not go over the line. And that's what books allow. Silence of the Lambs is a great example. It's, you know, compelling reading because it lets us right into that cell, but we're always safe. So, you know, who knows why we all love it, but I know I do.
And thank goodness for, your bank account that people do
Yeah.
want to.
First of all, James, I want to say thanks for having me again. Everybody's really busy, so for the people who are listening, thank you. I hope you weren't too bored, but the work speaks for itself. If you read the book, I think you'll find a bit of American history there that you didn't know, and be entertained and carried through these pages. That's the kind of story I like to tell, and I've been doing that since I was a People magazine writer. As you say, it's just a fascination we all have. So I appreciate getting this chance to talk about these characters. They're real to me. They did amazing things. They're undervalued in history. Even Ida Wells, when she died, the New York Times didn't give her an obituary. They corrected that a couple of years ago. So it's just wonderful that there are people like you out there, your listeners and you, who have this interest in crime stories and what they mean to us as Americans and what they say about this country. So I appreciate this time. Thank you,
Well,
James.
well, you're welcome. Just let's tag with your website or your author page or your Facebook or whatever.
Yeah, I got a long last name, but my website is Alex Tres, ALEXTRES.com. James, you have a long last name, so you got to shorten it sometimes. So there's some other books I've written. Like I said, I've written a lot of Ghost wrote a lot of books. A little bit of something for everyone, so check it out. Read this book if you can, and you can email me there with any questions about anything, and just get in touch. So it'd be lovely.
Great. And what I say to my audience, you can do it, however you want to do it. Again, I did the library because my wife says I can't buy any more books. And but you can do Amazon, you can do Barnes and Noble. I like to say to people when I do have to buy a book because it's not available or I have to have it ordered, I like to use a brick and mortar local bookstore
Yeah, me too.
because I mean I got nothing against Amazon. They're a great resource, but we need we need
They're
small
coming back.
business.
The stores are coming back, so I try to
Right.
support them when I can. Get the paperback version. Obviously, it's cheaper, and yeah, go hunt it. You'll find it somewhere.
Great. Well, again, I appreciate your kind words. And again, I'll be back to you on something else that I picked up of
Yeah.
yours. Take care.
Okay, James. Thanks so much. You have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
So I'd like to thank you folks for kindly tuning in for another episode of Murder Most Foul. If you liked what you heard, I hope you'll tell your friends. Information about the podcast and an email link that can get a message to me can be found at the podcast's website. The address being www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces.com. So until we meet again, stay safe, and for God's sakes, don't murder anyone.